I'm going to talk about farming with beneficial insects, both the insects that provide pest regulation as well as pollinators. And I know there's a huge amount of interest in pollinators right now and Live. I think Chris was actually going to talk a little bit about Live's wildflower program. But I have minimized the pollination part of this talk a little bit just because vineyards are not insect pollinated. So I have some information here about pollinators, but I'm really focusing more on conservation of those insects that are actually providing a service with some economic value to the vineyard. As Chris mentioned, I work for the Xerces Society. I direct our endangered species and aquatic programs. We are based in Portland, Oregon, but we have offices all over the country. Our core office is in Portland. But we work on native pollinator conservation, primarily in agriculture, as well as sort of general agricultural biodiversity, endangered species conservation, aquatic issues, and then we also work extensively on pesticide policy. We were founded in the 1970s by Robert Michael Pyle. He's a scientist who studies butterflies, and he's also an author. Initially as a society of butterfly scientists who wanted to prevent butterflies from going extinct. So we were named after the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first butterfly in North America to go extinct as a result of human activity. It used to live along what's now the Presidio in the San Francisco Bay. And so this group of butterfly scientists wanted to prevent future butterfly extinctions and founded a small society. We've now grown to about 50 staff members, in a relatively short amount of time. I've been here for 10 years, and there were 5 of us when I started 10 years ago. So it's been exciting to be part of an organization that is still pretty small, but I think able to do more with a larger staff. So our approach to invertebrate conservation is broad. We do conservation planning work, we do on-the-ground restoration, we provide education, like short courses like this, as well as technical guidance. We produce a variety of publications, which I've set out there, and we provide one-on-one technical guidance to growers and land managers and others as well. We do some applied research, and we partner really extensively with researchers. I think our role often is taking the academic research and making recommendations from that research and making it accessible to people who can use it. People who may not have the time to read through like 500 scientific papers. So we do a lot of reviews and provide policy recommendations and land management recommendations on things like pollinator conservation and other issues. We also have a number of active citizen science programs where we're engaging everyday citizens who are not trained as scientists to contribute to research with direct applications to conservation through programs like Bumblebee Watch or our Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper or Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count. So we have programs where people can contribute to these efforts and really help the general community further conservation of species. And then we engage in policy as well. So a little bit about my background. I grew up on a vineyard in the southern Willamette Valley. This is actually my older sister and my dad. I couldn't find a picture of me in the vineyard, but I know there is one. I just didn't have it handy. That was planted in the 1970s, and then my folks still run this vineyard. They sell their grapes to A to Z right now. They're kind of getting near retirement age. But I went on to graduate school at UC Davis, where I studied conservation biocontrol in vineyard agroecosystems, looking at how to reduce insecticide use targeted at grape leafhoppers, which is a major agricultural pest in California, as well as I know some parts of Oregon, though not necessarily the Willamette Valley, and trying to enhance biological control with the native fairy flies. So one thing that has struck me through these experiences that I've had growing up on a vineyard, spending summers, working in this small vineyard outside of Corvallis, and then working in Northern California, is that in the Willamette Valley, I feel like we don't really have the insect pest pressure that people have in California, and potentially even in Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon. And I think that, or I hypothesize that that's attributable to 2 factors. Different climate up here, It's just, we've got much colder winters. Pests are not able to survive through the winter and breed and build up populations to really reach that pest status. But also, if I can generalize, I think our vineyard systems in the Willamette Valley are much less of a monoculture than in California. Not true across the board, but there are so many areas of Northern California that are just wall-to-wall vineyards with very little natural habitat. And I think that we are probably getting pest control services in the Willamette Valley and not even really knowing it. And with a warming climate, a changing climate, we're already seeing certain pests emerge in the Willamette Valley that have not historically been problematic, like cutworms, for example. So I guess if you take nothing else from this talk today, and I do think I'm probably preaching to the choir, since many or all of you are live members and are already, it sounds like, farming really sustainably and really valuing biodiversity as part of your farming operation. But if you take nothing else away today, I guess I just want to make a plea to conserve native habitat where it exists around vineyards, and to consider restoring native habitat if you are in an area that's experienced rapid vineyard expansion and there's not a lot of habitat left, because looking at the trends of acreage of vineyards that are being planted, it's really quite daunting. And so that's a bit about my background and my experience.
Do you have a connection to the any kind of political grant finding money to help us do some habitat restoration?
Yes.
I had some people out that said, well, if you fucked it over and taken all these trees out by your creek and it was eroding away, we have money for you. But it's fine. We like that you have white oaks, but we don't have any money for you because you haven't screwed it all up.
Oh, interesting.
It's like,
Who was that was out there?
The guy from the U.S. Agricultural Office in Orlando.
Okay, so it was in RCS?
I think so.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So
Well, I'm going to
that's
talk
the message
about,
I've heard so far.
I'm going to talk about NRCS programs that are available at the end of this talk, and financial assistance that's available. We work with farmers in all different crops all over the country who utilize NRCS programs for pollinator conservation and beneficial insect conservation. Those funds are out there. You have to go into the NRCS office and that's the first step, and tell them you're interested, you want to do that. And so if you've already engaged with someone from a particular office and they've said your habitat's too nice, we can't help you, then I'm not sure what to recommend from there. But that is the biggest source of funding. There are other grants, like OWEB, our state lottery funds, has grants to work with private landowners and restore white oak habitat. I mean, I'm sure, just because you have oaks, I'm sure there are some things you can be doing in the understory, and so I'm sure there are things that can be done, but you might just need to ask another person or something. But I'll talk about that at the end. Do feel free. I'd love for this to be more of a conversation than a lecture. I've got a lot of slides. I'll probably try to breeze through some of them pretty quickly. It was a challenge to me to fit this presentation into such a short time. But if something doesn't make sense, just stop me, or just feel free to ask. And with that, I'll get going. So here's what I'll talk about today. Just a general introduction to beneficial insects and pollinators. I suspect that many of you are really knowledgeable about beneficial insects and pollinators already. So hopefully I'm not telling you too much that you already know. And then I'll go through recognizing some key groups of both pollinators and beneficial insects. This is not really an ID course. To get really deep into insect ID, I could spend a day just on beetles. So I tried to provide an overview of some of the most important groups generally, and some that I think you'll see of both pollinators and beneficial insects. But you're not going to be an expert at the end of this couple hours. Then I'll go into some farm practices that can support these insects. Again, a broad overview with a few examples in a variety of cropping systems. And then I've got a short module on technical and financial resources available. And I just want to say there are a number of publications, one of which that you can pick up from the FAR table is using Farm Bill conservation programs using Farm Bill programs to support pollinator conservation or something like that. And that one really summarizes a lot of what I'll be talking about. So if you haven't picked that one up yet already, make sure you get that one. It's like the black and white photocopied publication, kind of the least pretty one. And then if there are any additional questions, feel free to ask them. And for anyone who wants to stay, I brought an insect net and some vials and some ID guides, and we can move outside and actually look at insects at the end of the course. So Chris and I walked around right before, or around 9:30, we walked around the vineyard, and there's not too much in the vineyard, but there's a really nice like landscaped area adjacent to the vineyard where we found a lot of pollinators and some beneficial insects, so that might be a good place for us to start. And then if people want to walk in the vineyard, we can go in, but I didn't see there's not much in bloom except for a few stray dandelions, and I think I found a lacewing egg, but there are not too many insects active in the vineyard right now. Okay. So I'll start off with an introduction to beneficial insects. Very few of known insects are actually pests, about 2%. The rest of the insects that occupy the world are either directly beneficial to humans by providing some sort of ecosystem service, pollination, pest control, nutrient recycling, or are really important for food webs in terms of even as herbivores. That's a really important role they're playing in the food web, even if they're not actually crop pests. And yet most of the chemicals that we're using kill all insects, friends and enemies alike, as Rachel Carson so eloquently said. And I like to show this quote at the beginning as well. The greatest single factor in preventing insects from overwhelming the rest of the world is the internecine warfare which they carry out among themselves. So just noting that there's this constant stream of predators and prey going on in nearly every ecosystem, including agroecosystems, that we can take advantage of. So just to be clear, I'm going to be talking a lot about conservation biocontrol today, and that is the approach that we really support at the Xerces Society and promote. But there are really 3 different types of biocontrol. There's classical biocontrol, where pests or parasites of pest species are actually imported outside of their native range to control usually an exotic pest. Historically, ladybugs were imported in this way to control aphid pests. There are a number of other examples, and it can be very effective, but sometimes the non-target risks are hard to predict. And so,
What does that mean, non-target risk?
Yeah, so for example, historically the USDA imported ladybugs to control aphids in agriculture, and now we've got the near extinction of one of our native lady beetles due to competition from some of these imported lady beetles.
Oh.
And so it's actually been so effective, it's naturalized everywhere, this imported lady beetle, and it's outcompeted some of the native species. Similarly, we have similar stories like that with other biocontrol agents that are imported, and I think that just happens when you're introducing something outside of its native range. It can have unanticipated consequences. There's augmentative biocontrol, and that's like purchasing parasitoid wasps from an insectary, or purchasing ladybugs from your garden store and releasing them. And that's really a temporary measure. When people have studied it, it's usually found to be ineffective. Praying mantids as well. People can buy those from a garden store and put them in their garden. They usually don't actually work. They don't actually regulate pests. Oftentimes they are, especially with ladybugs, they are in migratory mode, and they will disperse from the area as soon as they're released. So we don't really promote that approach to biocontrol. But the third type is conservation biocontrol, and that is really enhancing the native insects that are already in an environment and figuring out how you can build up the populations of the native predators and parasitoids to regulate pests that you may have. So the annual value of pest control provided by wild beneficial insects is valued at between $4.5 and $12 billion each year for U.S. crops and about $100 billion worldwide. So this is a really significant ecosystem service that I think we're largely overlooking. And sometimes it's being done by insects that are so small, like this parasitoid wasp here, that you may not have noticed when I showed you the beetle farther away, the tortoise beetle farther away. They're so small, yet they're providing this really significant ecosystem service in the case of this parasitoid wasp. So conservation biocontrol can provide an alternative to using insecticides in some cases, can support the natural ecosystem, increase your farm diversity. When compared to classical biocontrol, it can reduce the risks of unintended consequences, reduce management costs, and can be valuable to both pollinators and other wildlife. And I think there are some marketing opportunities to integrating conservation biocontrol into your farming operation. Okay, now a brief introduction to pollinators. And I have to say I tried really hard to stitch both pollinators and beneficial insects into the same presentation. Usually we're giving these separately. But pollinators are essential to maintaining healthy ecosystems. More than 85% of flowering plants worldwide require animals, and primarily insects, to move pollen just to be able to reproduce. Wild bees alone contribute an estimated $9 billion a year to the U.S. economy. If you add honeybees and other managed bees into that, it's it's a order of magnitude more.
So if your neighbor has honeybees, does that mean your wild bees are leaving, or?
There may be some competition. If floral resources are limiting, there may be some competition between honeybees and wild bees, or it may not matter. And I'll talk about honeybees a little bit in a minute. I got into entomology through wrangling honeybee swarms and keeping bees and, harvesting honey, and they're amazing creatures. But I think if someone's keeping honeybees because they're concerned about the conservation of bees, that's sort of the wrong reason. But there are very good reasons to keep honeybees, so I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
What are good reasons to keep honeybees?
Well, if you want to harvest honey, it's I think.
Besides that, that's only for our own personal satisfaction.
Yeah, honeybees are livestock. They're introduced, and I'll get to this in just a moment in the presentation, but they're an introduced species, and they're managed, and as an industry, there have been colony losses that have been pretty staggering, and I think if any industry, be it cattle or poultry or wine grapes, experienced 40% loss in 1 year of their crop or their livestock, everyone would be concerned, and I think that's absolutely justified. But as a species, the honeybee is not at risk, and yet there are a number of wild bees that are going extinct, perhaps have already gone extinct, that are much more at risk and that we should really be concerned about. And so, I work a lot in wildlife conservation. As I said, I direct the Endangered Species Program, and I'm just often blown away by wildlife conservation groups that are taking on the honeybee as a conservation issue, because to me it's an agricultural industry issue, and it's an important one, but it's not a wildlife conservation issue. I think this just advanced automatically. Anyway, I'll get back to this, but we can talk about honeybees more.
What's your opinion on mason bees?
My opinion on mason bees is that if you put up nesting blocks for them, they will come, and that's probably the best approach to having mason bees. I have done it in the city of Portland. I've done it in Davis, California. Yeah, they're a great pollinator, and they're really fun to watch. And if you put up nesting blocks and drill some holes in them, they'll fill them up. But the mason bee trade, I've got some concerns about it. It's not well regulated.
So if you put things up, they'll come?
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's really our approach to habitat restoration, is just build it and they will come. We're not, in terms of the biocontrol approach, we don't recommend people purchasing insects from stores. We recommend putting in the habitat and letting the native species populate. So providing a home, resources that they need, and they will come. And we haven't been disappointed yet. So pollinators are required for roughly a third of all crop production. So we need pollinators for 85% of all plants, but of the food that we eat, it's about 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat. Yet, many of the pollinator-dependent crops that have the vitamins and minerals we need, like vitamin C, are insect pollinated. So all of our berry crops, or many of our berry crops, are insect pollinated, and a lot of the other foods that make our life really wonderful are pollinator dependent. And here's a photo from a typical, I think it's a Whole Foods grocery store, of your produce choices with pollinators. So this includes all of the foods that are insect pollinated, as well as those that are relying on wind for pollination. And then here's that same produce aisle without pollinators. So we still have our oranges and our grapefruits and a few of our vegetables, but really we're lacking, our avocados, our apples, a lot of the foods. I don't see berries in there, but we would be lacking our berries, a lot of the foods that make our life really wonderful. So even though grapes are not insect pollinated, I think it's important to emphasize just how important pollinators are both to our native ecosystems and our food supply. Pollinators are also really important for other wildlife that you may care about. A quarter of the diet of birds and mammals consists of seeds and fruit. So that's across the board. Seeds and fruit that needs a pollinator, and primarily an insect, to form. So just thinking about importance in the food chain. If you care about birds, which I know a lot of people here in the Willamette Valley do, a quarter of them rely on seeds and fruits that needed a pollinator. And then beyond that, a number of our songbirds directly eat insects. So those are both the pollinators and the beneficial insects. There are a number of really compelling reasons to farm for insects, in addition to wine grapes. Yet, it's kind of a hard time to be an insect. I don't know if you guys remember 4 years ago, actually, about 4 years ago this week, and I remember because I was a week away from delivering my daughter, who's turning 4 next week, there was this Wilsonville bumblebee kill, where an estimated 60,000 bumblebees dropped out of the linden trees at the Target parking lot, and there was just a lot of public concern and media around this, and this is just a really visible example of a legal pesticide application where everything was by the book. The trees were treated totally according to label and what was legal, and we had just this mass bumblebee die-off in a parking lot.
The trees in the parking lot were treated with something that killed them?
Mm-hmm. They were treated with a systemic neonicotinoid insecticide. Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because there were, I think, aphids or mealybugs. I think there were aphids on the linden trees, and they were secreting a sugary, sticky substance that was dropping on cars, and so it was well, yeah, so people who were parking in the Target parking lot, but it makes you wonder, how often does this happen not on a parking lot, or not outside of Portland, Oregon, where you have a lot of people thinking about these issues? If it wasn't on a parking lot, you might not have noticed. So, in this case, it was just this kind of neat community response. They actually ended up netting all the trees to prevent further die-off once people realized what was happening. So it's a hugely expensive operation. I went out there, like I said, a week before I delivered my daughter to collect some samples for analysis, because at the time we weren't sure if it was a pesticide poisoning or what. And while they were netting the trees. Anyway, this is pretty amazing. Okay, so the European honeybee is by far and away our most familiar, our most economically important pollinator, and it's a managed pollinator. We've seen an average of a 50% decline in managed hives since 1950, and at the same time, a doubling of the cropland requiring bee pollination. This colony collapse disorder and other losses are likely attributable to disease, pests, poor nutrition, pesticide stress, combination of those factors. There has not yet been one conclusive reason why we've had all these honeybee die-offs, but a number of factors are likely to blame and are correlated with higher colony losses. Here's just an illustration of how the annual losses have changed over time. And you can see, 40-45% in some years. And yet, the honeybee itself, as a species, does not face any level of extinction risk. It was introduced hundreds of years ago for pollination and occurs all over the world, is easily bred, is managed extensively. So though it's having a hard time, it's not the species to focus on if you care about wildlife conservation. The rusty patch bumblebee this year became the first bee in the continental United States to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. It's declined from 87% of its historic range. Working on this species was one of the first projects that I took on at the Xerces Society about a decade ago. And I actually wrote this petition to get it listed, so it's really, really exciting to see it be protected. And across the Midwest, people... We don't. This is a species that historically occurred across the entire eastern U.S. And eastern seaboard, or upper Midwest and eastern seaboard, and now occurs in like 15 locations. I mean, it's been lost from, probably 99% of its historic range, but so it's really rare now. But there are really neat conservation efforts going on now, and we're seeing a lot of resources going into habitat conservation for bees in the upper Midwest. But we do have a number of bee species here that are perhaps equally endangered. So we've worked with the Bumblebee Specialist Group for a number of years to evaluate the extinction risk of our bumblebees, and we've used the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List criteria to understand which bumblebees may be most at risk, and we've determined that a quarter of all of our bumblebee species in North America are at risk of extinction, anywhere from near threatened to critically endangered. In Oregon, Franklin's bumblebee occurs in southern Oregon. It's probably extinct. The Suckley cuckoo bumblebee is critically endangered. And there are a number of other species that are vulnerable to extinction, that have been lost from extensive parts of their historic range or are far less common than they used to be. And really, for the most part, other than maybe the western bumblebee listed here, western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee, other than those two, these aren't really on anyone's radar. Last summer, I spent some time out at Stoller Family Estate in Dayton, doing some conservation planning work, and we found the yellow bumblebee, which is at-risk species. It's 60% less abundant than it used to be, and it was persisting. It was nesting in the oak woodlands on Stoller's property. And this is one that you will find in the Willamette Valley, although it's far less common sort of outside of the core of its historic range. We've got our federally listed, federally endangered Fender's blue butterfly, our Willamette Valley endemic species as well. And then monarch butterflies, which are maybe not the most common and maybe never were the most common butterfly in this part, but are distributed across the country, have undergone really dramatic declines in the last couple of decades with agricultural intensification. In the western U.S. alone, they've declined by about 74% since just the late 1990s. So here we have a migratory species that's probably our most well-studied butterfly of all butterflies in the U.S. It's probably the only butterfly that we're really tracking to this extent, and it's blinking out. And these losses are really similar to monarch butterfly losses in the eastern U.S. We don't really know much about the conservation status or extinction risk of our beneficial insect species, with perhaps just a few exceptions. This is the 9-spot lady beetle it's like the New York State insect and used to be one of the most common species and is really, really hard to find now and was likely outcompeted by the introduced lady beetles that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so that was my brief introduction to pollinators and beneficial insects, and now I'm going to go through the identification part of the course, or the how to recognize pollinators and beneficials part of the course. Does anybody have any questions before I switch gears? Okay, I'm going to start with pollinators. There is a huge diversity of pollinator species. And these are just some of the insects that I'm showing you, from beetles to butterflies to moths to flies to wasps to bees. And this is not even to mention the bird pollinators and some of the mammalian pollinators that are out there. But bees are what I'm going to focus on today because they're by far and away our most important pollinators. They provide food for their young. They are actively going to flowers and collecting pollen to feed their babies. No other insect is doing that. And in doing that, they're transporting the pollen from one flower to the other and thus really effectively achieving pollination. So many of our other pollinators are more incidental pollinators. They're not necessarily seeking out and collecting massive amounts of pollen to provision their young. And bees also exhibit what's called floral constancy, where they will find a species of flower that they like, and they'll go to many different individuals of that species, and so that helps the plant be pollinated. There's a huge diversity of native bees in the U.S. beyond the honeybee that I already showed you. Nearly 4,000 species exhibiting a huge range of forms and functions. We've got our tiny, this brownish Peridota compared to just the face of a large Xylocopa, a Carpenter bee, just to show you that there are bees that are so tiny. You'd really need a hand lens to get a good look at it, and then some really large. Our bumblebees are some of our largest, and our Xylocopa, our Carpenter bees, are even larger. Most of our native bees are solitary, with the exception of the bumblebees, which are social. They have a queen and a colony, much like honeybees do.
How big of a colony?
For bumblebees, a few hundred individuals. Yeah, versus honeybees, you've got tens of thousands.
And they're in trees or in the ground?
Generally in the ground, underground, on the surface of the ground. Some species nest in tree cavities, like our black-tailed bumblebee. And within our native pollinators, we have both specialist species and generalist species. So species that will specialize in a certain type of flowers, and species that will just visit all sorts of flowers. This is a depiction of a general solitary bee lifestyle. This is a mining bee, but it's pretty typical for many of the pollinator or many of the solitary bees. So it's on an annual cycle, and in the spring you'll have the adults foraging at flowers, collecting pollen, digging holes in the ground, putting a pollen ball underground, laying their egg on the pollen ball. So this is a bee egg on the pollen ball. That egg will hatch into a larva, or like the caterpillar form of a bee. It'll eat the pollen, pupate. That's like the equivalent of the chrysalis if it were a butterfly. Pupate underground and then emerge as an adult again, and that whole cycle will take a year. And so most of our native bees have this type of life cycle. They're nesting in the ground, they're provisioning their young, and they're living in this way. We have a variety of native bee nesting habitats. We've got ground nesting bees. We also have cavity nesting bees, like our Osmia. Someone asked about our mason bees, our Osmia, as well as our ground nesting bees are over here, including bumblebees are primarily ground nesting, and then we've got our cavity nesting bees over here. This is again a picture from Stoller Vineyard that I took last summer, or that my colleague Candace took last summer. About 70% of our native bees nest underground. They often are just holes in the ground. They resemble ant nests. Oftentimes you find them in bare ground or areas with sort of just patchy vegetation, low plant cover, often in sandy or loam soils, and the nests can be anywhere from a few centimeters to like a meter deep. About 30% of our native bees nest in cavities, like these bamboo stalks that have been cut, or these wood blocks that have had holes drilled in them. And you can provide habitat for cavity nesting bees by providing artificial cavities or conserving snags and brush piles, vegetation that bees can tunnel into on their own. A number of plant stalks can be, bees can excavate them and use them for nesting. So here are some examples of some cavity nesting bees. Again, you can see the egg and the larva developing in these cavities. Often, with a lot of species, they will have a long, thin cavity like that, and they will lay multiple eggs in a single cavity.
Do they make the little walls between them?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and that's a fat larva up there, and then a pupa and an adult just about to emerge. Bumblebees are a group of species that I feel like I know a bit more about than the rest of the native bees. I've done a lot of work on bumblebees over the years. We've got 46, so I'll probably talk about them a little bit more today. We've got 46 species of bumblebees in the US. They're probably our most famous and definitely our most well-studied of our native pollinators. But again, make up a really small proportion of the total diversity of native bees in the US. They are social. Their colonies are founded by a single queen. They persist for just 1 year. So
What does that mean, persist?
the life cycle of a colony just lasts 1 year. And I'll run through the life cycle in just a second. So let me know if it doesn't make sense after I show you that image. We've got typically a few hundred workers. They often nest in abandoned rodent burrows or sometimes under tufts of grass, occasionally in tree cavities. And you can conserve bumblebee habitat by leaving unmowed areas and certainly if you see bumblebee colonies, letting them be. So this is a depiction of the annual bumblebee colony life cycle. I'll start with the spring. You have a queen foraging, establishing a colony, finding a nest site, usually underground, laying some eggs, collecting drinking nectar, collecting pollen to provision this first brood of workers. She then lays eggs, those eggs hatch, the first brood of workers comes out, and from that point on, she becomes an egg-laying machine. And she is just stuck in the hive, laying eggs, and her workers are taking on all of the foraging responsibilities outside of the hive, collecting pollen and nectar.
How does she provide enough food for that first?
For the first one.
Yeah.
Right. That's a really critical period for bumblebee colony establishment because often flowers are limited in this early spring time period. And so that's when bumblebees are most vulnerable, is in the early spring as well as in the late fall. And if she doesn't find enough food, she either makes a really small colony or she dies. She doesn't make a colony.
So she's foraging for food for
Yeah.
at that time.
So in the early spring, you'll see these giant bumblebees coming out, and those are the queens. And then usually a few weeks later, you'll see really tiny bumblebees. And every generation of bumblebees throughout the summer, like the first generation of workers, are really tiny, and they're all female. And then the next generation is a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. And by the end of the summer, you see the new queens. And it sounds like you've seen this. You see the queens again. And then usually in the fall or late summer, the colony produces reproductives. So the colony produces new queens and males, and they leave the hive, the queens mate, the males mate and then die, the queens forage some more, and then find a place to spend the winter, usually it's called a hibernacula, usually like in a little area in the ground. They overwinter, just the queen like that, until the weather gets warm again and they can go out and forage and start a new colony. So a queen lives a full year. All the other bumblebees only live for a short period of time in the year. But we know that the size of the colony is really directly related to the amount of floral resources out there. Bumblebees are really amazing. They are active earlier and later in the day than honeybees. They can fly in much cooler weather, even when it's like just slightly rainy. You can see bumblebees out there. There's a huge diversity of bumblebees with different tongue lengths, and they all specialize in, they are generalists, but they specialize in different types of flowers. They can learn to access resources from complicated flowers, and they have this really neat quality that honeybees do not have, which is that they can buzz pollinate. And if you've ever seen a bumblebee visit a tomato flower in your tomato garden, you can hear this audible buzzing. And what it's doing is it's grabbing onto the tomato flower, which does not release its pollen freely. It's got its pollen locked up inside the flower, detaching its wings from its flight muscle, and vibrating its flight muscles, its wing muscles, with its wings detached. And it's that sonication that's getting the plant to release its pollen. So about 8% of plants are buzz pollinated or benefit from buzz pollination. They might be able to be pollinated by an insect that can't do this, but honeybees absolutely can't do this. There are a few other large-bodied native bees that can do this. But this is just an argument that we need more than honeybees. So that's why I'm showing you this slide. Shooting stars, a really lovely Oregon wildflower, are only pollinated by buzz pollinations. And there are a handful of other crops and wildflowers that need this type of pollination. So, some people say, well, let's just, keep our honeybees, not worry about the rest of them. And this is just an argument that we need pollinator diversity out there to have healthy natural ecosystems and agricultural ecosystems.
What was the flower that you were just showing?
These are dodecathin, the shooting star.
Shooting star?
Yeah, you'll find this if you go up in the mountains, like in the Cascades.
Do they have to be a certain elevation to live?
The shooting stars? That's a good question. Has anybody seen shooting? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you can plant them in your garden. But has anybody seen shooting stars in the valley here? Anybody? Any plant?
You know, over the mountains, but not down here.
Yeah, they're definitely more common in the mountains, but yeah. Okay, so back to the identification part. Bees are often confused with flies. And so this is just a quick and dirty slide to show you the difference between bees and flies. So bees actually have 4 wings, 2 pairs of wings, whereas flies only have 1 pair of wings. So the insects on the bottom are flies, and the ones on top are bees. We've got a bumblebee and I think an andrina on that side, and then on the bottom we've got a syrphid fly and another fly. Bees tend to have long antennae. Flies have these little stubby antennae. Bees, if you look really closely, have a very skinny, like constricted waist where their abdomen meets their thorax. I apologize for not having a pointer.
Just a stick right there.
I can use my net. So where the abdomen meets the thorax, it's really constricted, whereas flies have much more of a broad waist right there. Bees, because they're actively collecting pollen, they have pollen-carrying hairs somewhere on their body, usually on their legs, sometimes on their bellies. Flies are usually bald, with the exception of those flies that are really closely mimicking bees. And then bees have really long tongues, whereas flies have these little stubby, sponge-like mouth parts. Bees are also commonly confused with wasps. Both bees and wasps have 2 pairs of wings, but wasps do not have pollen-carrying hairs. They are usually bald. They often have very constricted wasp waists, even more so than bees. Often they have these long and skinny waists. They often have really long legs, and they often have really distinctive ovipositors or stingers.
Are there good wasps and bad wasps?
There are. And I'm going to talk about parasitoid wasps later on here, but even some of our bad wasps are important predators. So I think it's important to recognize that, wasps can be pests, certainly around here, and you always have to weigh, whether they're presenting a hazard. If you've got a tasting room or people working in the vineyard that might get stung, you probably can't tolerate having wasps. But if you can, they're probably going to be some really effective insect predators, like if they're in an area that they're not posing a hazard to people. Even our yellow jackets. So honeybees are sort of medium-sized. We'll see some when we go outside. They have black and orange-ish brown markings on their abdomen. They're colonial with a queen and a bunch of workers. Again, you can have like 25,000 honeybees in a single hive. So their colonies can get quite big, and they live for years and years. So you'll have a single queen. Unlike bumblebees, you'll have a single queen honeybee living for many years, and a whole colony, albeit smaller, but a whole colony living through the winter. Honeybees are the only species with hairy eyes, and then they've got these distinctive curbiculae or pollen baskets on their hind legs. All right, bumblebees are large-sized, robust bees. They can be black, yellow, orange, or brown. They've got colored hairs. Females also have these corbiculae or pollen baskets on their hind legs. But bumblebees they're like the teddy bears of the insect world. They've got really hairy, fuzzy bodies, and like you kind of want to hug them if you're an entomologist. We also have our longhorned and our digger bees. They're more medium-sized bees, really hairy bodies, striped abdomens with pale hairs, and really prominent hairs or scopy hairs for collecting pollen on their hind legs, like you can really see here in this Sebastra bee, as well as in the Melisodes, the longhorned bee right here. And they often have long antennae, like in the Melisodes, which is also known as the longhorned bee. You'll see these on sunflowers and cosmos, as you see here, all the time. We also have some really tiny bees. We've got our small carpenter bees, our Ceratina species. So they're really small, slender. They've got these scopy on their hind legs. They can be metallic green or metallic blue. They've got shiny hairless abdomens. They can have markings on their face that is actually like the colored exoskeleton. It's not from colored hairs. That can be yellow or white, and the males tend to have more prominent markings on their face, and these are pithy stem nesters. We've got our mining bees and our polyester bees. They're more medium in size. Many of these species are pollen specialists. You often have stripy abdomens in these species with pale hairs and really, really hairy hind legs. And then we've got our small dark bees, which encompasses a number of different groups, but of these I'd say the Halictids, the Halictus are the most common, these little sweat bees. They're small to medium sized, slender. They can be blackish or metallic. In Hylaeus are yellow-faced bees. They do not have scopy on their legs. They actually swallow pollen and then throw it up to provision their young. And their bodies are a little bit hairy. They have just these like very fine or short hairs on their bodies. And then we've got our metallic sweat bees, also in the Halictid family. So our Agapostomen, as well as some other species, they're sort of medium-sized, and these ones are really beautiful. I don't know if you've seen these out in your garden. Just bright green, metallic, sometimes with stripy black and white abdomens, sometimes with green metallic abdomens. They do have hairs on their hind legs, but they're inconspicuous, and their bodies do have these fine short hairs on them. Then we've got our leafcutter bees, our Megachilids, and these are, some Megachilids are commercially managed. Some leafcutter bee, alfalfa leafcutter bee, for example, are used commercially for alfalfa pollination. They're sort of a medium-sized, kind of chunky bee, and they're distinctive in that their pollen collecting hairs, their scopy are on the underside of their abdomen. So they're like what we call our hairy belly bees. And they have really prominent mouth parts or mandibles.
Leaf cutters, they cut leaves?
Yeah, they do. So they, different species visit different plants, but they will, say, take a maple leaf and actually cut out circles of the leaf so you can see damage on the leaf and use it to line their cell walls. So here you can see like little leaf tissue circles, which they've used to like glue a cavity shut. And they also use it to line the walls where they're laying their egg and provisioning their young. And then we have our mason bees in the genus Osmia. Again, they vary in size from small to large, kind of robust. They can be metallic blue or green. They have hairy bodies, but the hairs aren't not super dense. And these are also hairy belly bees. They've got the scopy on the underside of their abdomens. And then lastly, and these are the hardest ones, I have to say, even for trained entomologists who are teaching bee identification courses, we have cuckoo bees that parasitize other bees and lay their eggs in their nest, and they look so much like wasps, but they're not uncommon. They're just, unless you know the particular genera of cuckoo bees, it's almost impossible, in my opinion, to distinguish them from wasps because they tend to mimic, with that very thin thread-like waist and just the general gestalt of the body, it looks a lot like a wasp, but they're actually cuckoo bees. And I do have some identification resources that I use, and if we have time and go outside, I'd be happy to share those with folks who are interested if people want to dig deeper than just this brief introduction on identifying bees. Anybody have any questions before we move on to beneficials? Yeah.
So do they just collect pollen on the hairs? Is that kind of
Mm-hmm.
so there? And then it doesn't fall off like does it stick?
Yeah, they can like pack it in
Really?
into the hairs. Yeah.
And it just sticks. And then how do they get it off? They just kind of shake it off, or
That's a good question. Or brush it off? Yeah, I mean they can groom themselves once they're in. Yeah.
Huh.
I assume they use their legs and their mouth part. That's a good question. I'm actually not sure. Yeah.
Does the yellow jacket have a predator that you could introduce in the area?
That's my question.
Yeah, right. Like what eats yellow jackets? They're so well defended. That's a good question. Okay. I don't know. and just to
Why do the yellow jackets like vineyards so much? Is it the grapes that they're attracted to, or is it just?
I mean, I think they are getting they are like actually feeding on the grapes, right? When you have a lacerated berry, they're also I think predating on insects in the vineyard. I think they probably like something about the soils as well since they tend to nest underground. But yeah, I mean, yellow jackets can be a pretty significant vineyard pest. Okay, recognizing beneficial insects. So there are a number of groups of common beneficial insects and other natural enemies, other beneficial invertebrate species. But to break them down into sort of your basic groups, we've got our insect predators, our insect parasitoids, which is a parasite that kills its host, really the definition of a parasitoid. And among those you have both generalists and specialists. And then we have a ton of non-insects that provide really important pest regulation services, from spiders to harvestmen, otherwise known as daddy longlegs, centipedes, mites, especially in vineyards. We've got predatory mites, pseudoscorpions, nematodes in the soil. And some of our predators and parasitoids are also pollinators. They may be regulating pests in an early life stage, like as an immature, and then as an adult, they are actually visiting flowers, collecting nectar, eating pollen maybe, and providing some amount of pollination service. So I think providing habitat for beneficial insects and pollinators is really, in most cases, you're going to be doing the same thing for both beneficial insects and pollinators. If you are providing a native flowering hedgerow, you're going to be attracting both beneficial insects and pollinators to your farm. The life cycle of beneficial insects can be either incomplete metamorphosis or complete metamorphosis. And incomplete, as shown over here with these true bugs, is where you've got your eggs and they hatch into nymphs. And the nymphs, or the immature insects, look just like the adults. They're just smaller and their wings aren't quite as developed. And so you have the nymphs and they just go through a series of instars where they molt and get a little bigger each time. But they generally have the same, they generally eat the same thing as nymphs as they do when they're adults. And then you have your insects like your beetles, which is just like the bumblebee I showed you, butterflies, where you've got these 4 distinct life stages. You've got egg, larva, and I'm sorry, this picture is really hard to see, but sort of a grub-like larva, kind of caterpillar stage, a pupa, where it's transforming from the caterpillar or the grub to a winged adult. And in this case, we often have the immature and the mature forms differing in diet and habitat. And our main groups of biocontrol agents that go through complete metamorphosis are beetles, flies, wasps, and lacewings. Predators will hunt, kill, and then consume prey. Commonly, they're generalists. They feed on a wide variety of prey, and they can feed on something even when a primary prey, even when a pest population isn't present or isn't high enough to really be at pest status. And one characteristic of a good biocontrol agent is that it's a ravenous feeder. Our true bugs, we've got our assassin bugs and our ambush bugs. These are some of our really large and noticeable beneficial insects. Some can be over an inch in length. They go through incomplete metamorphosis, so both the nymphs and the adults are predatory. A characteristic of all true bugs is that they have this piercing, sucking mouth part. And some true bugs are herbivores, some are predators. With the predators, they use this mouth part, as you can see right here, to pierce their prey, sometimes insert digestive enzymes, and then suck out the insides. They tend to overwinter in leaf litter under bark. As adults, some of these true bugs will consume nectar from flowers as adults, so they'll benefit from those kinds of plantings. And they can be really aggressive predators of some of our larger pests, some of our beetles, caterpillars, leafhoppers. We also have damsel bugs, which are much smaller. They're only about a half an inch long. They're really fast. These are also true bugs. They've got these enlarged raptorial forelegs for catching prey. See them right here. They overwinter in field debris, mulch, and brush, and they prey on smaller insects as well as eggs. And then some even smaller true bugs, between 2 and 5 millimeters, are our minute pirate bugs and our our minute pirate bugs and our big-eyed bugs. And I have to say, I was giving a course for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District last week, and we were at a farm, Clean Water Services farm, out in the Hillsborough area, and minute pirate bugs were the most common beneficial insect that we found throughout the farm. They were all over the place, and that's really consistent with my experience elsewhere. These guys are really tiny little black bugs. These are the minute pirate bugs, but they're all over the place, and I think probably underappreciated in terms of pest control services that they're performing. They're predatory both as adults and immatures. Here's an immature minute pirate bug feeding on an aphid, and you can see it's almost the same size as the aphid. They overwinter in leaf litter under bark, and they can prey on small pests and even seek out prey that aren't very abundant yet. Then we have our lacewings. Chris and I actually found some lacewing eggs, or a lacewing egg, out on the blackberries adjacent to the vineyard this morning. Lacewings, again, as immatures, are really fantastic predators. Here's a lacewing larva eating an aphid. This is what their eggs look like. They're really distinctive because they're these little white ovals on a thread-like stalk. These guys are voracious predators. A single larva can consume like 400 aphids in a week. I mean, that's just astounding. So these guys are really fantastic insects to have around. They are all over. You can buy them in insectaries, but we don't recommend you do that. They are here. They are probably at your farm already. If there's habitat, they will come. Lady beetles are probably our most famous predatory beneficial insect. They are predatory as immatures and adults, but the adults also feed on pollen and nectar from flowers, and so they benefit from habitat plantings. And individuals can consume thousands of aphids over their lifetime, which is, again, pretty astounding.
Where do they like to live, lady beetles?
On vegetation.
From a certain kind or any kind?
All sorts of vegetation,
Okay.
yeah. And then we have our ground beetles, primarily carabid beetles and rove beetles. These guys are ground dwelling. You can find them under debris, bunch grass, logs, in cracks in soil. They'll prey on cutworms, caterpillars, grasshoppers, other beetles. Fun fact, they can consume their body weight in prey daily, and they often kill more prey than they can eat. So if you have ground pests, you can encourage populations of predatory ground beetles. And there's been a lot of work at Oregon State University pioneering beetle banks and improving ground beetle, increasing ground beetle populations for farms. And these guys are mostly active at night, and they're really fast runners. And then I just had to put in a tiger beetle, not that common on farms, but you may find them on farms. These guys are really amazing predators. This one in particular is found on the coast. It's the Siuslaw hairy-necked tiger beetle. And I just wanted to point out that they have these like sickle-shaped mandibles. They're like the fastest insects they're the fastest of all insects, and they're just voracious predators. So count yourself lucky if you've got tiger beetles on your farm. We've got soldier beetles, which are often found on flowers. They're predatory both as larvae and adults. Adults need nectar and pollen. And they're active at cooler temperatures than many other insects. And they overwinter again in leaf litter or loose soil. Our flower flies are hoverflies. I saw a hoverfly out in the vineyard this morning. They're predaceous as larvae and flower visitors as adults, and providing some incidental pollination. They're not out collecting pollen to provision their young or anything like that, but I think they are visiting flowers and providing some sort of incidental pollination. As immatures, this is the baby flower fly or hoverfly, the syrphid, eating an aphid here. And then we have a wide variety of predatory wasps. Yes, some of them are pests in vineyards. Some are not, like our spiked, our mud dauber wasps, for example, are actively out hunting caterpillars and provisioning their young with them. As adults, they feed on flower nectar, commonly eat caterpillars and other large-bodied insects, and they tend to nest in the ground or tunnel cavities, or to, like in the case of mud daubers, to build their nests out of mud. They're really kind of amazing engineers of the insect world. Okay, now I'm moving from predators onto parasitoids. And I think parasitoids are perhaps the most underappreciated group of beneficial insects because they tend to be so small. There are some larger ones, but so many of our parasitoids are really, really tiny. They can lay their eggs on a host, on a pest species, on the adults, on the caterpillar or immature stage, or within the eggs. And they're highly effective. Our parasitoids are wasps and flies. This is the species that I worked on as a grad student. This is a fairy fly, a minute egg parasitoid, and it's like the size of a head of a pin. And it parasitizes grape leafhoppers, a major pest in California, as well as some other parts of Oregon. And these little guys, their lifespan increases from like 2 days to 10 or 15 days when they have access to nectar from flowers. And they're able to lay more eggs in their pests. So you can see how adding some diversity to your farm might increase the effectiveness of a parasitoid like this. But they're also extremely sensitive to sulfur. So that's really the area that my graduate work focused on is sulfur disrupting conservation biocontrol in this system.
And your conclusion was yes?
Yeah, sulfur is absolutely disrupting it. I tried taking sulfur out, but I didn't add flowers, and I wasn't able to get effective regulation of leafhoppers in the plots where I used more targeted fungicides. And so were I to continue that work, I would try adding flowers so they weren't starving to death, and taking out these sort of broad spectrum toxins and using more of a targeted fungicide to see if I could get effective biocontrol. But that was that's sort of where I stopped my graduate work. So, yeah.
While we're on the subject of nectar, I'm afraid to ask the question. You don't ask the question you don't want to hear the answer to.
Okay.
What role does blackberries play in supporting these types of insects, beneficial insects?
Yeah. I know that blackberry flowers are commonly pollinated and visited by a wide variety of bees, a lot of bumblebees. Blackberry as a plant can provide, it can host alternate prey for a number of these beneficial parasitoids. So it can be important. That said, it's everywhere, and a lot of people don't want blackberries taking over their vineyards. So I'm not advocating that you leave blackberries, but oftentimes when we're looking at resources available on a farm to groups of pollinators or beneficial insects, if we're going to be taking out a huge stand of Himalayan blackberry, we want to consider replacing it with an equal abundance of something native that won't be invasive and that won't, cause the problems that blackberries cause on fence lines and things like that. But I think,
And are you gonna be talking about distance from plantings to?
a little bit. I mean, I have a few examples. I have to say, the research on specific crops is not, like, we don't have a ton of research on exactly how far. We have examples from certain crops, but I don't think there's been a ton of conservation biocontrol research to come up with those very specific evidence-based recommendations. So I'll show you what is known. But I think typically the closer you have the habitat, I mean, some of these parasitoids, like these mimerid wasps, may travel a few hundred feet in their entire lifetime. And so the closer your habitat is to the crop, the better. And if you're able to put, cover crops, below the canopy or on the floor of your vineyard, then that's probably going to be the best strategy for enhancing populations of these kinds of parasitoids. So there's a huge diversity of parasitoid wasps. They tend to overwinter within their host. Most are specialists preying on one particular insect group or species. They can persist in environments with even low levels of prey, and as adults they need nectar. Oftentimes it's easier to recognize the damage from a parasitoid wasp than to recognize the wasp itself. So these are parasitized aphids, and these are normal, healthy aphids, the red ones. The parasitoids ones are what we call an aphid mummy, and they look kind of bloated and they're a different color, and then here's the parasitoid. So it's often much easier to see that a parasitoid has been active than to find the insect itself. We also have flies that are parasitoids, like our common tachinid flies, and they look a lot like house flies, except that they have these thick hairs on their body that are not so typical of the flies that you'll be swatting in your house. They are generalists. They're parasitoids of many pests, and they can be really abundant and really effective parasitoids. And we have a wide variety of beneficial species, natural enemies that aren't insects. Spiders, predatory mites, especially important in vineyards, and I recognize that one of the only arthropod pests that people experience here in the northern Willamette Valley are mite pests. So I think predatory mites can be really important here. We also have soil nematodes, entomopathogenic fungi. Here's a fly that's been parasitized by a fungus. And then I just have to show you a close-up picture of a predatory mite attacking a pest mite, a two-spotted spider mite species. Because it looks like it's out of a science fiction movie, and it's just amazing to see these animals up close.
How big are they?
Mites, like,
Can you see them with your naked eye?
you can. They're often red or yellow. The
Little dots?
the predatory mites are pear-shaped, and they're sometimes sort of clearish, greenish yellow. And you can certainly see them with a hand lens, but we can look and see if we can find some mites on the grape leaves. They're usually a couple millimeters big and running. They can often run really fast. So I'll go further. Okay, now moving on to farm practices that support pollinators and beneficial insects. Does anybody have any other questions or need a bathroom break before I move on to this segment of the talk? Okay. I think I'm past the halfway point. So really, habitat is key to have a diversity and abundance of beneficial insects as well as pollinators. So natural habitat provides food sources for both pollinators and beneficial insects, so pollen and nectar for pollinators as well as beneficials, and alternate prey for those predators and parasitoids that need something to eat or lay their eggs in during a different time of the year. It also can provide physical structure, shelter for nesting bees, overwintering sites, egg laying, and refuge from pesticides, assuming that your habitat is sufficiently far from any treated areas on your farm. So many of our predatory insects eat either pollen or nectar or both when their prey are not available or as adults. And yeah, some switch diets, so as immatures they'll be predaceous, and as adults they'll be consuming floral resources. So flowers are really important for maintaining these populations. Wildflowers also sustain bees when a crop might not be in bloom. In the case of vineyards, they're just sustaining bees solo, so it's really important to have wildflowers that are blooming throughout the year. Habitat can harbor alternate prey when crops are absent. Like in this case, we've got a lady beetle, immature, eating oleander aphids on a milkweed plant. And habitat can also provide shelter, as I just mentioned, overwintering, egg laying, nesting. Pests tend to thrive in monocultures, but beneficial insects really need more. And I brought up a piece of research from the literature that looked at a ton of different studies in a wide variety of cropping systems, and they found that when compared to simplified agroecosystems, crops that were surrounded by landscape complexity had better insect regulation 74% of the time, so 3 out of 4. This does not always work, and I just have to put out a disclaimer. There are cases when habitat does not enhance pest control, and there are particular pests that just do not have effective natural enemies at this point, in certain introduced pests. So it will not work in every situation every time, but I think there's a ton of, or there's evidence building to indicate that where you have complex habitat structure on your farm, you are likely to have better pest regulation. Here's a nice study from the Central Valley where Laura Mirandon found that hedgerows increase pest control in tomato fields. So when they looked at tomato fields that were surrounded by these flowering hedgerows, they found 3 times higher parasitism of stink bug pests, the Conspirus stink bugs, than in tomato fields that did not have hedgerows surrounding them. We've got some emerging research that sand wasp predation of brown marmorated stink bug is happening more frequently in areas surrounded by native habitat that supports these sand wasps. And I don't know how applicable that will be to here. We do have other species of sand wasps out here, but they're not that common in the valley.
We don't have a lot of sand.
We don't have a lot of sand, right? I see these guys on the coast all the time. In other cropping systems, research has demonstrated that if more than 20% of your farm is in diverse natural habitat, you see pest control by beneficials throughout the fields. So again, this is a review study. And similarly, there's actually quite a bit more research on natural habitat and pollination. For example, in canola fields, when 30% of a canola farm is in natural habitat rather than fully planted, farmers have greater yield because of the increased pollination service. I know that's not super relevant to this cropping system, but I wanted to share the concepts. And so just to illustrate that, here's a sample farm of canola that's entirely planted, field border to field border. 100% of it's planted in canola. When 30% of it is left in natural habitat, the yield is actually greater. And similarly, I'm just showing you 2 examples of pollination, but similarly, in the Cape Valley of the Central Valley of California, watermelons are pollinated completely by wild bees when 30% or more of the area within about a kilometer of the farm is in natural land cover. And this study for pollinators has been replicated in all sorts of different crops, all sorts of different regions, and it's pretty consistent. I mean, it's not always exactly the same percentage, but when a certain percent of natural habitat is left, pollination services are achieved. I think as we study it more, we're going to see the same thing with pest control, but there haven't been as many studies done. So just to reiterate, you may be on a farm in this type of landscape, in which case you may be getting a lot of your pest control needs taken care of. You may have really great populations of native bees, or you may be farming, your farm may be more in a landscape like this, in which case I think there are a number of opportunities to add diversity and bring back some of that landscape complexity that was likely there historically. So now I'm going to move on to the farm planning part of this talk and just briefly mention some of the habitat restoration opportunities, and then I'll follow up with some of the cost share programs that are available, some of the resources available to fund this type of habitat work. So we've got flowering hedgerows, non-flowering hedgerows, filter strips, field borders, pollinator and insectary strips, and cover crops. Native flowering hedgerows often are native shrubs and trees. Well, we recommend having multiple bloom periods so that you have at least 3 species in bloom, sort of in every season from early spring to late fall. They can provide a really important source of nectar, pollen, and alternate prey in the early spring for both pollinators and beneficial insects. Provide nesting and shelter habitat. They can be screens for wind and dust if you've got mite issues. They can also provide seeds and berries for birds, and they're permanent. So of all the different habitat types, hedgerows are pretty amazing in that once they're established, they're these permanent fixtures. They can be integrated into landscaping. They can be really beautiful, and so if you have a vineyard that's also a winery and a tasting room, and you're wanting to make it look really nice for the public, I think there are really great opportunities to plant some flowering hedgerows that are really attractive, and maybe even put some signage up, help educate some of the many visitors that might come to the vineyard about the plight of pollinators and the importance of providing habitat for these animals. Here's just an example hedgerow from Fong Farms in California with early spring forage, nesting resources. Elderberry was used for stem nesting insects as well as sumac. We've got some really large shrubs. This one's well established. That helps to provide a windbreak and also reducing dust because it's right next to the road. And they also are able to harvest elderberry from the elderberry bushes. Also, windbreaks and shelter belts. Non-flowering hedgerows can provide shelter to species that can't tolerate windy conditions, like our syrphid flies that are really good predators as larvae. And again, some people just plant windbreaks, conifers for pesticide screens. Maybe if you're an organic farm and you're bordering a conventional farm that's using a lot of pesticides that tend to drift, this is a really good strategy. You don't want to make your windbreak attractive to pollinators, but it can provide a really nice physical barrier to protect the habitat on your farm. So buffers and filter strips can capture sediment, excess nitrogen, increase infiltration, can also reduce, I don't know if E. coli is a concern, probably not so much here, but there are a lot of different benefits of these buffers and filter strips. Field border habitat, I know sometimes it's hard to find those little places on your farm to put in habitat, but there's almost always like a little place where you can add a patch, and that's the nice thing about insect conservation. Just doing a little bit, adding a little strip or a little patch can do a lot. So here's an example from a blueberry farm in the area where we've done a native wildflower planting. And here's another example from another berry farm. And I just put this one up so you can see what the planting looked like in May versus July, and that's the same, that's taken from the same point of reference on the farm. Just showing the different blooming and how beautiful these can be as well. There are a number of useful species for field border habitats. I didn't include all the slides with recommended species for this region, but we do have regional planting guides. I think some over there and some available on our website as well if you are, looking to design one of these and plant one of these. We have a lot of those resources available. Here's another example of an insectary strip from Montana. These are some of the folks that we work with that supply like Annie's macaroni and cheese, and they've got 6,000 acres of mostly grain crops, and they've planted field borders throughout their farm, these 30-foot wide strips with more than 20 species of native grasses and forbs, and are just seeing a wide variety of benefits from these insectary strips. Here's more of an annual insectary strip in New Mexico, and a little bit of research showing that that the insectary plants are helping to provide some increased beneficial insect populations, regulating some pests in pumpkin. And then of course cover cropping, this is perhaps an extreme example. I sort of wondered if I should even show this. I don't know if people let their cover crops get that big, but I don't know, tell me what your gut reaction is to seeing this picture.
Looks like a big stem of mustard.
Yeah, yeah. So this one might not be the ideal photo, but you can do, annual or seasonal crop rotations, and of course there are multiple benefits to soil health, etc. In vineyards. You can also do native plantings, sort of as a cover crop. This is from a Clickitat winery up in the Columbia River Gorge, where they've got a native grass and wildflower understory. And then here's an example of a beetle bank. And I don't know if anyone with a vineyard would put in a beetle bank, but it might be an option, especially if things like cutworms become more of an issue up here. Oregon State University and especially Gwynell and Ellen have done a lot of work on determining the right number of beetle banks to incorporate into your farm. It's a raised bed with perennial bunch grasses that provides cover for these predatory ground beetles. It's just a place for them to nest, and they can be really quite effective at preying upon ground-dwelling insect pests. And then another thing you can do is add shelter to your farm, providing some brush piles, some rock piles, some messy areas. If it looks really messy, you can put up a sign, pollinator habitat, and we have those signs to educate people that might think it looks really messy, that this is what you're doing. Okay, and then moving on, I just wanted to talk really briefly about some farm practices to enhance beneficial insects, and I think I'm going to go pretty quickly through this because I don't think growers here are really using insecticides for pests. But I just wanted to note that, while pesticides can be a really useful tool, insecticides pose really the greatest risk to insects, beneficial and pests alike. Again, I think this is probably pretty redundant for this audience, but we recommend an integrated pest management approach where using chemical controls for pests is absolutely your last resort. You're implementing conservation biocontrol, you're using resistant varieties and cultural control methods, and you're monitoring and scouting and trying to prevent pest problems, and you're only really using chemical controls when you've determined that nothing else is working. So a wide variety of pesticides can harm both pollinators and beneficial insects. And pesticide mixtures have become increasingly of concern, especially when certain fungicides are mixed with insecticides. One of our primary concerns is with the increased use of neonicotinoid insecticides. These compounds are incredibly persistent in the environment. They're toxic, and frequently they're used prophylactically as seed coatings in a variety of crops. And they can persist for up to years in plants and soil. So here's just a graphic to illustrate how not only are neonicotinoids drifting like other insecticides drift, but they're also moving through the watershed, underground, leaching, and they're being found in water bodies, including like in the Tualatin Basin, where they're basically broadly toxic to all insects. They have both lethal and sublethal effects on pollinators and other beneficial insects, and they can lead to secondary pest outbreaks. I also mentioned pesticide mixtures. Mixing some azole fungicides can enhance toxicity of both neonicotinoids and pyrethroids, so be aware of that. And just a lot of this I think is just really common sense on mitigating risks when pesticides are used. Yeah, go ahead.
Just go back to the azole, as in like tibuconazole,
Yeah.
like DMIs.
Yep. DMIs.
Okay,
Mhm. Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. There have been some recent bee poisoning incidents with these tank mixtures. And again, maybe not a huge issue since we don't have an insect pollinated crop. We don't have bees visiting, foraging on grapes other than incidentally, but
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So just common sense, follow the label, select the least toxic option, don't use on habitat that's in bloom. If you've got a cover crop, don't spray when your cover crop's in bloom. Take steps to reduce drift, protect any areas of habitat if you are planting pollinator habitat. And I know, Chris, you were going to talk a little bit about some of the pollinator habitat that you've been encouraging. If you are planting habitat, make sure that that habitat's protected from any treatment that you're applying. So yeah, avoid spraying plants in bloom. Be selective with herbicide use. That's probably this slide's probably more relevant to this audience than the other ones. But just be aware if you're using herbicide throughout your vineyard that you might be removing foraging resources for your pollinators and beneficial insects as well. And then there are some resources through UCIPM, as well as this How to Reduce Bee Poisoning from Pesticides that you can use to evaluate, risk with certain agricultural chemicals. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to talk briefly about some of the technical and financial resources available through the NRCS to support conservation, like some of these practices that I've just mentioned. So there are resources available. You really need to speak with a NRCS service provider in your area to get these resources. Xerces Society we also have a number of technical service providers for the NRCS. So we have a number of joint positions where we've got a Xerces Society conservation biologist or restoration ecologist sort of embedded in the NRCS office and providing technical guidance on pollinators and beneficial insects. And we have a number of staff members who are technical service providers for the NRCS, and so we can do conservation planning. And we've done this on other farms. NRCS will pay or provide cost share funding for Xerces to do a conservation plan for your farm, and then that enables you to tap into some of these farm bill programs to get cost share funding for implementing some of these things. So in the 2008 Farm Bill, pollinator habitat was made a priority for every land manager and conservationist for these conservation programs administered both by NRCS and Farm Services Agency. And we encouraged at that point the inclusion of pollinator habitat in USDA conservation programs. Those provisions were all maintained in the last Farm Bill, as well as some added provisions to support beekeepers. A number of Farm Bill practices can also support creation of habitat for beneficial insects and protecting habitat from pesticides. This is a publication I think all of you should have. It's black and white in the copy you have, but it's kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about, or more detail than what I'm going to talk about, but some of the technical and financial assistance programs available through the Farm Bill to support pollinator conservation. Through conservation technical assistance, the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, EQIP, or Environmental Quality Incentives Programs, and various easement programs. So there's technical assistance available for planning and installing pollinator habitat. We've developed a ton of guidance documents. I've tried to bring a sampling of those, but check out our website for more. We've developed a lot of these documents for the NRCS. And there's also a number of Xerces NRCS partner biologist positions in several regions of the country where we're available to do consulting with you on adding this habitat. So through the Conservation stewardship program, there are cost share incentives for enhancing both pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. Generally require at least a half an acre of habitat for every 40 acres of enrolled land. You need to have 9 species of flowering plants, so 3 species in bloom early, 3 species mid, 3 species late season in bloom. And it needs to be protected from insecticide use on adjacent areas. Through EQIP, natural resources concerns on ag land and forest land are addressed. You can improve or create wildlife habitat. Through EQIP, we can do these conservation activity plans. That's what I was just mentioning earlier, where we develop a sort of a farm plan. And there's also funding through a conservation innovation grant. Also through EQIP, we have the organic initiative, where NRCS helps producers transition to organic and meet national organic practice requirements, including biodiversity conservation, maintaining or improving water, soil, woodlands, wetlands, wildlife, and pollinator habitat can fulfill the biodiversity requirement under this. So some specific NRCS practices that can be funded: herbaceous weed control, practice 315. Conservation cover, practice 327. Just showing you some examples. Cover cropping, practice 340. Here are some good species for use in cover crops. Lacey Facelia especially is great. It's like a bee magnet. Critical area planting. Hedgerows are a specific conservation practice. IPM is a specific, integrated pest management is a specific conservation practice, so protecting beneficial insects and other natural resources. And our pollinator conservation staff, and I should just, a little disclaimer, this is not the program that I run and manage, so if people are interested, I'm probably going to refer you to our pollinator conservation program, but Xerces staff through our NRCS partnerships can do conservation planning. Here's an example of a diversified organic farm with the potential resource concerns of pollinator habitat, pest management, as well as drift mitigation identified. And here are just some example recommendations of NRCS practices that could be implemented and could one could get a one-to-one cost share to actually install a pollinator hedgerow, up at the top there, or a conservation cover, practice 327, over on the left, and a cover crop throughout the crop. Okay, so there's a lot of technical and financial support available. As I said, I brought a few publications to this end, but please let me know if you'd like more information. Xerces site also does habitat restoration consulting. Some of this can be done through conservation activity plans, or we do one-on-one consulting just independently as well, like in cases where people don't want to go through the NRCS. And this is actually a really old slide. I'm sorry. We've restored more than 420,000 acres of habitat since 2008, and developed a number of habitat installation guides to provide really specific recipes for how to restore habitat on your farm to benefit pollinators and beneficial insects. So please visit our website. We have a number of publications available. And just to wrap things up, why farm with pollinators and beneficial insects? You can enhance pest control. It's good stewardship. You're being a good steward of the land. Provides educational opportunities for any visitors you might have to your vineyard or your winery. And there are also, lastly, marketing opportunities. And some of this might be through live, but I also wanted to mention that we have a new bee-friendly, the Be Better certified labeling opportunity, and this is just launched this spring. It's been in the works for many years. We're working in collaboration with Oregon Tilth, who's our third-party independent certifier, but it's a certification system that I think in many ways is really compatible with live standards, but it's specific to bee-friendly farming. So it's suitable for large, small, organic, conventional farms. We've got some of the world's foremost pollinator scientists on the board of Be Better certified, ensuring that the standards are science-based and really rigorous, and truly protective. And really, we ask that people establish flower-rich habitat protected from pesticides, protect and create nesting sites, eliminate high-risk pesticides, and utilize an IPM approach, incorporate pest prevention strategies, and limit disease spread from managed bumblebees if you're using them, which you wouldn't be in the state of Oregon. So just with that, I just want to note that of the land on Earth, nearly 40% of it is in agricultural use, and so farming is really the single largest land use, and it's absolutely critical to the future of biodiversity. Farmers have an essential role to play, and I think that biodiversity is really critical to the future of farming on the flip side. That I just want to leave you with a quote from a entomologist who was famous once upon a time in the early 1900s, over 100 years ago, Dr. Edith Patch, and she predicted that by the year 2000, the president would issue a proclamation claiming that the land areas at regular intervals throughout the U.S. would be maintained as insect gardens. They'd be planted with milkweed, hawthorn, and other plants that could sustain populations of butterflies and bees. And sometime in the future, she predicted entomologists will be as much or more concerned with the conservation and preservation of beneficial insects, or beneficial insect life, as they are now with the destruction of injurious insects. So we're not totally there yet, but I like to show this quote. And thanks to Live for inviting me to give this presentation, and the Chemeketa Wine Studies Department for hosting, of course to NRCS for funding the time and the publications to give to you guys, and to Xerces Society members who also support our time and our work.